The first act of my rebellion cost nothing and weighed nothing, and no one who saw it would have called it rebellion at all. It was a folded blanket. That is where it began, with a wool blanket, gray and plain, that I carried from the guardroom stove to a boy who had been left to shiver in the East Gallery, because the Queen Consort had decided the fires there did not need lighting. I have stood the king's watch for 19 years. I have learned the discipline of the still man, the one who does not move, does not speak, does not answer whatever passes before him. It is the whole of what we are. A royal guard is a column of the house made flesh. You stand, and by standing you say that the order holds, that the roof will not fall, that whatever storm comes through the gates will break on you and go no further. I believed that. I still believe it. What I did not understand, until the winter I am about to tell you of, is that a man can stand so long and so faithfully that he mistakes stillness for goodness. That he can guard a house so well he forgets to ask what the house is doing to the small people inside it. My name is Aldwin Rhee. I was a sergeant of the inner watch of the royal house of Harrogate, and this is the account of how I stopped obeying, quietly, lawfully, one small refusal at a time. The woman who wore a crown she had not earned and used it to be cruel to 3 children who could not fight back. I set it down plainly, because plainness is the only honest register for a thing like this, and because I promised a small girl I would tell it true. Let me put the house before you as it stood that winter, so you will understand the ground I walked. King Alaric was our sovereign, a man in his late years, more shadow than sun by then. His first wife, our late Queen Isolde, had died some 6 winters before, a bright, plain-spoken woman the servants had loved, whose portrait still hung in the long gallery with her gray eyes following you down the corridor. Grief had bent the king. Into that bent and lonely space had come Morwenna, the Queen Consort, younger, sharp-featured, all polish and cold intelligence, a woman who had married a wound and set about deciding who was permitted to touch it. She had brought with her 2 grown children of her own from an earlier marriage, Lord Cassius, oiled and idle, and Lady Verena, who watched everything and forgot nothing. And there was Ilara. Princess Ilara was the king's daughter by Isolde, a widow herself now, her own husband lost to fever 3 years gone, and she had 3 children who were, to my eye, the last living warmth in that cold pile of stone. Torin was the eldest, 11, a serious boy who held his shoulders like he thought the whole house might tip if he let them drop. Malin was 9, quick and watchful, with her grandmother Isolde's gray eyes exactly, so that old servants would sometimes stop and press a hand to their mouths when she rounded a corner. And Bram was 6, small, round-cheeked, forever half a step behind his brother and sister, forever cold, because he felt the cold worse than anyone I have known. They were not the Queen Consort's grandchildren, they were the king's. And that I came to see was the whole of Morwenna's quarrel with them. Every day those 3 children breathed under that roof, they were living proof that the house had a bloodline older and truer than hers, a line she could marry beside but never into. She could not strike at Ilara without the king seeing, so she struck at the children in the small ways that leave no mark and make no sound. A cold gallery, a meal served late and half-warm, a tutor dismissed. A birthday overlooked, then loudly and publicly remembered a day too late, so that the forgetting looked like the child's own fault. Cruelty with the volume turned all the way down. Cruelty a still man could stand and watch and tell himself was none of his affair. The blanket was in December, the hardest week of it. I had come off the North Post and was crossing the East Gallery, a long, unheated stone run that connected the family wing to the schoolroom, when I saw the small shape at the far window seat. Bram. He had a slate on his knees and his lessons open, and he was working at his letters with a stub of chalk, and he was shaking, not crying, working. His breath stood in front of his face like a little ghost. He had been sent there to do his figures, and the woman who ran the household schedule for the Queen Consort had crossed the East Gallery off the list of rooms to be warmed, because, I learned this later from the fire boy, who was frightened half to death telling me, The Queen Consort had said the children were soft and needed less coddling than their mother gives them. I stood in the archway a long moment. Every year of training in me said, "This is the household's business. You are the watch. You guard the gates and the persons of the family. You do not carry blankets. You do not question the running of the rooms. A guard who starts deciding which of the king's orders are kind and which are not is a guard who has stopped being a guard." That is true, mind you. That is genuinely true, and I want you to hold it, because the whole weight of what I did rests on the difference between disobeying an order and refusing to pretend an unlawful cruelty is an order at all. But the boy was 6, and his lips were going the color of the winter sky, and no order I had ever been given required a child to freeze at his letters to spare a grown woman the trouble of a fire. So I went back to the guardroom. I took a blanket from the stack by the stove, our own blankets, the watches, nothing of the households, nothing I would have to answer for taking. I carried it back through the gallery, and I laid it around the boy's shoulders, and I said, "Sergeant's orders, young sir." A soldier keeps his hands warm or his letters go crooked. And I set my own gloves, the great white ceremonial gloves, far too big for him, over his small blue fingers, and told him to breathe on them, and stood my post at the archway where I could keep the draft off his back with my own body, and said not one word more. That is all it was, a blanket and a pair of gloves and a man standing where the wind was. If you had asked me that night whether I had defied the Queen Consort, I would have said no, of course not. Don't be absurd. I lit no fire she'd forbidden. I moved no household staff. I countermanded nothing. I had simply declined to let a child freeze in front of me. But I know now that was the first stone out of the wall. Because Bram looked up at me with the king's own eyes, no, Isolde's eyes, the gray ones, and he said, very seriously, "Are you allowed to do that?" And I found I did not have an answer that was both honest and comfortable, so I gave him the honest one. "I'm allowed to keep the king's grandchildren from harm," I said. "That's the oldest order there is in this house, older than anyone who might tell you different." He nodded like that made perfect sense, and went back to his figures, warmer, and I stood my post, and something in me had shifted that would not shift back. I did not decide that night to make war on the Queen Consort. Understand that clearly, because it matters to everything after. I am not a man who decides things in a single hot moment. What I decided was much smaller and, I think, much more dangerous to her in the end. I decided to start seeing, to stop letting my discipline do my conscience's job for it, to stop calling a thing the household's business the instant it made me uncomfortable. And once a man starts truly seeing, he cannot stop, and the house I had guarded for 19 years turned, room by room, into a different house than the one I thought I knew. I began to notice the pattern of the meals. The family dined together perhaps twice a week, all of them at the long table, the king at its head, and on those nights the children ate well, and Morwenna was warmth itself, laying a hand on Bram's hair, asking Torin about his riding, praising Malin's needlework in that bright carrying voice that reached the king's end of the table. But on the other 5 nights, when the king dined alone in his rooms or not at all, the children ate in the schoolroom, and their trays came up from the kitchens by way of the Queen Consort's own steward, and I began to keep count of what arrived on them. Thin soup, bread going stale. The good dishes, the roast, the winter fruit, the sweet things a child lives for, went to Lord Cassius's rooms and Lady Verina's, and what reached the schoolroom was what was left. I counted it for a fortnight to be sure I was not imagining a grudge. I was not imagining it. It was a policy. It was quiet, deniable, and exactly severe enough to leave the children hungry and small without ever leaving a bruise a physician could find. I began to notice the tutors. Good ones, an old master of letters the children loved, a music mistress who had taught Ilara herself, dismissed one by one on invented economies, and replaced with the Queen Consort's people, who reported to her steward what the children said, whom they saw, what their mother told them. The schoolroom had become a listening post aimed at Alara's family, and the children were the unwitting informants, questioned gently over their thin soup about what Mama had said, what Grandpapa the King had promised, whether they had visited the long gallery lately and stood before the pictures of the gray-eyed woman. That was the thing she could not abide. I came to understand the long gallery. Isolde's portraits. The children loved to go there. Malin especially would stand before the largest of them, the one where the late queen was painted laughing with a hound at her knee, and she would tell Bram stories about the grandmother she was too young to remember, stories she'd stitched together from the old servants, half true, half invented, all loving. And every visit to that gallery was a small treason against Morwenna, because it reminded the whole house whose children these were, and whose they were not. I saw it. I began quietly to guard it. I could not light forbidden fires. I could not overrule the kitchens or reinstate a tutor or seat a child at a table where the steward had not laid a place. Those were beyond a sergeant of the watch, and any move that plain would have seen me transferred to the furthest cold gate of the realm within the week, and then who would stand in the East Gallery when Bram was sent there to shiver? So I learned to fight the only war a still man can fight, the war of small lawful refusals, of doors that happened to be open when they were meant to be locked, of a route on my rounds that happened to pass the schoolroom at the hours the children were most alone. I did nothing I could be charged with. I simply stopped doing the one thing she counted on every guard in that house to do. I stopped looking away. The first time she noticed me, it was over a lock. There was a schoolroom cabinet where the children kept their small treasures, Torin's carved horses, Malin's box of ribbons and her stitched things, Bram's collection of interesting stones, and most precious of all, a slim book of Isolde's own hand, a book of little verses she had written for Alara when Alara was a girl, which Alara had passed down to her children. It was the one thing of their grandmothers the children had that was truly theirs, not hung on a public wall but held in their own hands. And one gray morning the cabinet was locked, and the key was gone, and the steward said blandly that the Queen Consort had ordered the children's belongings inventoried and put in order, which is the sort of phrase that means nothing and everything at once. Malin came to me. She was 9, and she had already learned children learn this fast, in a house like that which grown people would help and which would only tell her to be a good girl and not make trouble. She came to me at my post by the schoolroom door, and she did not cry, which was worse than crying, and she said, "They've locked away grandmother's book. The steward has the key. He says we may have our things back when the Queen Consort decides. Sergeant Rhee, can she keep it? Can she keep our grandmother's own book from us?" Now here is where a lesser understanding of my duty would have failed both her and me. I could not break that lock. To break a lock the Queen Consort had ordered set would be to countermand her openly, and I would have been gone by nightfall. But there is a difference, and I want you to feel it, because Morwenna never once understood it, and it is the crack she eventually fell through between what is unlawful and what is merely unkind. Unkindness I could not command, but I knew the law of the house better than she did, because I had spent 19 years standing inside it while she had spent 6 years scheming around it. "Come with me," I said to Malin. "Bring your brothers, we're going to see someone." I took them not to the Queen Consort, and not to the king, who was too far sunk in his grief to be reached by a child's grievance, but to Princess Adela. Adela was the king's own sister, a spare, upright old woman with a voice like a closing gate, who had no power over the household schedule and wanted none, but who held one thing Morwenna could not touch. She was blood of Harrogate, senior in the line, and by the ancient custom of the house she was the guardian of the children's persons and property in law whenever their mother was absent or overruled. It was a dusty old office no one had needed in a generation. I had read of it years before, in the long, idle nights of a young guardsman studying the house he served. I remembered it now. "Your Highness," I said, standing in her cold parlor with 3 children behind me, "forgive the intrusion. There is a matter of the young one's property." Her Majesty the Queen Consort has ordered their grandmother's book sequestered pending her decision. I am only a sergeant of the watch and cannot judge such things. But I believe the guardianship of the late Queen's bequests to her grandchildren rests, in law, with the senior blood of the house. I thought your Highness would wish to know a decision was being made about it. I watched Adela understand in the space of 2 breaths everything I was not saying. She was old, and she was tired, and she had let a great deal slide in that house because it was easier to slide it. But she had loved Isolde like a daughter, and she had watched Morwenna reorder the whole architecture of the family around her own ambition, and here was a gray-eyed child of 9 looking up at her with Isolde's exact eyes, asking for a book of verses. Something in the old woman's spine straightened. "You believe correctly, Sergeant," she said. "The bequest is theirs, and its keeping is mine to decide, not the consort's. Send for the steward." The steward came and paled, and produced the key rather than explain to Princess Adela why he had it. And the book went back into the children's hands that afternoon, and I had not broken a single order. I had simply carried a question to the one person in the house, with the lawful standing to answer it the right way, and let the law do what a guard's fists never could. That was the second stone out of the wall, and this one Morwenna felt. She sent for me the next morning, not to the schoolroom or the gallery, but to her own receiving room, all gold and pale silk, warm as a coal. Every fire in the house seemed to burn in that one room. She let me stand at attention a good while before she looked up from her writing. When she did, her face was pleasant, which was the most dangerous thing it could be. "Sergeant Rhee," she said, "you have been a great deal about the children lately." "I stand where the watch posts me, Majesty." "Of course you do." She set down her pen. "And you carried a small domestic matter to Princess Adela yesterday, a locked cabinet, a book," a small smile. "You went to some trouble over a book of verses, Sergeant. One might almost think you had appointed yourself the children's advocate. That is not the watch's office, is it? The watch guards. It does not interpret." Here was the moment. I had known it was coming since the parlor, and I gave her the answer I had decided on, the answer I would give her in one form or another a dozen times over the winter, the answer that was true and lawful and left her nothing to charge me with, and left her, I could see, quietly furious that it did. "Majesty," I said, "the watch guards the persons and the rights of the king's blood." I carried a question of the young one's lawful property to the officer of the house whose office it is to answer such questions. I overruled no one. I broke no order. If I have understood the law of the house wrongly, I will be corrected and will obey the correction gladly. But I did not think I could stand in this house and let a matter of the king's grandchildren's rights be decided by the wrong hand, and call myself the king's man while I did it. The silence stretched. She was calculating, I could all but hear it, the click of it behind her eyes, trying to find the sentence in what I had said that she could carry to the king as insubordination. There was none. I had wrapped every refusal in the language of duty, because it was duty, and the terrible thing for her, the thing she could not forgive, was that a mere sergeant of the watch had just proven he understood the king's house better than the Queen Consort did. "You are very careful, Sergeant," she said at last, and it was not a compliment. "A guard learns care, Majesty. It is most of the trade." "Then be careful," she said, "that your care for the children does not become a want of care for me. I would find that regrettable for you." She took up her pen again. "You may go." I went, and I understood, walking back down that warm corridor into the cold of the rest of the house, that a line had been drawn and I was on the far side of it, and there would be no crossing back. She would watch me now. She would look for the error, the overreach, the plain disobedience she could hang me with, and I would give her none, not because I feared for my post, though I did, but because the children needed a man inside the house more than they needed a martyr outside it. My rebellion, if it was to be worth anything, had to be a rebellion she could never name, a silent one. So I made it silent, and I made it patient, and I made it lawful to the last inch. And I want to tell you how it grew. Winter deepened, and the campaign, for it was a campaign now on both sides, though not one soul in that house would have said so aloud, went underground and grew teeth. She could not dismiss me. I had given her no cause, and a sergeant of 19 years clean service is not turned out on a whim without questions the king's chamberlain would have to answer. So instead she tried to move me. Orders came down reassigning Sergeant Rhee from the inner watch to the outer gate, the cold north post, as far from the children's wing as the house could put a man and still call him a guard of the house. It was cleverly done. It looked like nothing, a rotation, a routine shuffle of the roster. But I knew what it was, and so, it turned out, did someone else. The reassignment was countermanded within the day, and the hand that countermanded it was the Crown Prince's. I should tell you about Rowan. The Crown Prince, Ilara's elder brother, the king's heir, was a younger, sterner shadow of his father, a man who had spent the years of the king's decline holding the reins of the house with a quiet grip most of the court never noticed. He was not a warm man. He was a watchful one, and he had been watching, it seemed, a good deal more than I knew. When the roster shuffle crossed his desk, and he read every roster, every order of the household, in a way his grieving father no longer did, he had struck my name off the transfer with his own pen and written beside it, in the small hard hand I would come to know well, Sergeant Rhee remains on the inner watch, by the heir's order. I did not learn this from him. I learned it from the roster clerk, a nervous man who showed me the amended sheet with the air of someone handling something hot. By the heir's order, 4 words, but they were the first sign I had that I was not, after all, standing entirely alone, that somewhere above me in that house there was another man who had also stopped looking away, and who had far more power to act on it than I did, and who had chosen, for reasons of his own, to keep me exactly where I was. I did not seek Rowan out. A sergeant does not go knocking on the heir's door to thank him for a favor never openly given, but I understood the message in it and I took it to heart. Hold your post. Stay near the children. Someone above you is watching this house with the same eyes you are, and he wants you where you are. So I held my post, and I kept my rounds, and I watched Morwenna's campaign against 3 children escalate through the dark heart of that winter. And I answered it, refusal by lawful refusal, in the only war a still man is permitted to wage. The next tier of it was the tutors, and it was through the tutors that I nearly lost. Morwenna had by now filled the schoolroom with her own people, and the last of the old masters had gone, all but the music mistress, Dame Pell, a stout, half-deaf old woman who had taught Ilara the harp 30 years before, and who loved those 3 children as if they were her grandchildren in truth. Dame Pell was the children's last friend among the household staff, the last grown person in their daily rounds who was theirs and not the Queen Consort's, and so of course Dame Pell had to go. The pretext was almost artful. A brooch went missing from Lady Verena's rooms, a garnet thing not especially valuable, but the sort of trinket a household can make a great noise about. And within the day the whisper had been arranged that it had been seen in the music room, that Dame Pell, old and poor and half-blind, had taken it. There was no proof. There did not need to be proof. In that house, the Queen Consort's suspicion was proof enough to turn out a servant, and Dame Pell was to be dismissed without character, without pension, put out the gates in midwinter after 30 years. And not incidentally, the children were to be taught that even the people who loved them could be taken away, that no attachment of theirs was safe, that everything and everyone they held could be removed at the consort's word. Malin came to me again. This time she was crying and trying not to, and the trying was terrible to watch. "They're sending Dame Pell away," she said. "They're saying she stole. She didn't. She'd never." "Sergeant Rhee, they're saying she stole and she didn't, and no one will listen, and she's going to be put out in the cold, and it's a lie." And here I will tell you honestly, my first instinct was rage, and rage is useless. My second instinct was to go to Adela again, and I nearly did, but I stopped, because I saw that if I ran to Adela with every grievance, Morwenna would soon arrange matters so that Adela was kept away, sent to the summer estate, made unreachable, and my one lawful channel would close. I could not spend Adela on every skirmish. I had to fight the ones I could fight myself, with the tools of my own office, and save the blood of the house for the battle that would truly need it. So I asked the only question a guard is entitled to ask about a theft. I asked to see the evidence. That is within my office. The watch has a lawful standing in any matter of theft within the house walls. It is, quite literally, the watch's business to know who has taken what and how. I did not accuse anyone. I did not defend Dame Pell. I went to the steward, correct and cold, and I said that a theft had been alleged within the house, that the watch had received no report of it as required by standing order, and that I would need the particulars for the record before any person was put out the gates as a thief. Because a servant turned out without character on an unrecorded, uninvestigated charge was a matter the watch was bound to log, and the log went to the chamberlain, and the chamberlain answered to the crown prince. Every word of that was true, every word of it was procedure. And every word of it was a wall Morwenna had not thought to build, because she had never imagined that the machinery of the house, the dull gray machinery of standing orders and required reports and logs that went up the chain, could be turned to protect the very people she meant to crush. She thought power was the crown on her head and the fear in the servants' eyes. She had never learned that in an old house, the deepest power is procedure, and procedure has no favorites. The steward could not produce a report because there was none. There was no witness who would swear. There was no brooch found on Dame Pell's person or in her room. It had never left Verena's jewel case. That had been the whole trick, an accusation with no object to it. And once the watch had formally logged that a theft was alleged and no evidence existed and a 30-year servant was about to be dismissed as a thief on that nothing, the matter had to go up. It went to the chamberlain. The chamberlain, no fool and no friend of scandal, sent it to Rowan. And Rowan, I heard this from the roster clerk again, my one nervous informant, read the log and asked one question: "Where is the brooch?" And when it emerged that the brooch had been in Lady Verena's case the whole while, found again the moment a real inquiry threatened, the Crown Prince closed the file with a single line: "No theft occurred. Dame Pell to be retained. The watch is commended for its diligence." The watch is commended for its diligence. That was Rowan speaking to me, past the chamberlain, past his stepmother, in the only language open to a prince who could not yet move against a queen. He was telling me the machinery worked, that I had found the seam in her armor, and that I should keep finding it. Dame Pell stayed, and the children learned a different lesson than the one Morwenna had meant to teach them, that the house had rules, and that the rules, worked patiently and from below, could hold even against a crown. But I want to be honest about the cost, because a rebellion told only in victories is a lie. Morwenna was not stupid, and I had shown her, twice now, that the procedure of the house was my weapon. So she set about, over the weeks that followed, to close those seams one by one. She had the standing order on theft reporting quietly revised, so that a report to the watch was no longer required before a servant's dismissal, dressed up as an efficiency, a modernization, buried in a page of dull housekeeping reforms that the king, when such papers reached him at all, signed without reading. She had the roster clerk who had shown me the amended sheets moved to another wing. She began, cleverly, to give her cruelties the shape of law, to make sure that, when she starved the children's table or stripped their gallery or dismissed their friends, she did it with a signed order, a documented decision, a form filled correctly, so that the next time I reached for procedure I would find that procedure was now on her side. That was the false dawn and its ending. For a few bright weeks I had thought the machinery of the house was mine to work, that patience and law would be enough, that I could hold the line indefinitely by the book. And then, one gray morning near the turn of the year, I found I could not. It was Bram again. It came back in the end to Bram, the smallest of them, the one who felt everything worst. The boy took a chill. Not a grave one, at first, a cold, a cough, the sort of thing a warm room and a physician and a few days abed would mend in any child. But warmth was exactly what Morwenna had spent the winter denying him, and the physician was now her physician, an oily, careful man named Ferrant who owed his place to the Queen Consort and understood precisely how much medicine his patron wished a given patient to receive. Bram's cold settled into his chest. The cough went deep and rattling, and the schoolroom where he was still, ill as he was, being sent to his lessons, because to keep him abed would have been coddling, stayed cold, because the fire in the east gallery was still, by the Queen Consort's standing order, not to be lit. I found him one morning slumped at the window seat. The slate slid off his knees, too weak even to keep working, burning hot to the touch though the room was ice, his breath coming short and whistling. He was 6 years old and he was seriously ill, and he was alone in a freezing gallery because a grown woman had decided that a child of his grandmother's line did not deserve a fire. And this, I will tell you plainly, this was the place where lawful patience ran out. Because a locked cabinet can wait for Adela, a dismissed servant can wait for the chamberlain, but a small boy burning with fever in an unheated room cannot wait for procedure, because procedure moves at the speed of paper and a fever moves at the speed of a fever, and I was not going to stand at my post and log a report and let the machinery grind while a child got worse in front of me. So I did the thing I had sworn I would never do. I disobeyed an order outright, knowing it, choosing it, ready to answer for it. I picked the boy up. He weighed nothing. He weighed like a bundle of kindling. And I carried him out of that cold gallery in front of God and the whole household, down the warm corridor, past the astonished faces of the Queen Consort's people, straight to his mother's rooms. And on the way I gave an order of my own, in the watch sergeant's voice that men obey without thinking, to the first 2 footmen I passed. Light the fire in the Princess Alara's sitting room and send for the house physician, not Ferrant, the house physician, old Dr. Vane. And if anyone asks who ordered it, you tell them Sergeant Rhee of the Inner Watch ordered it on his own authority and will answer for it. And I laid the boy in his mother's own bed in the warmth and stood at the door and waited for the storm. It came fast. Morwenna arrived within the quarter hour, and this time the pleasant mask was gone. This time there was cold fury in her, real fury, because I had done the one thing she had spent the winter making certain I could not do. I had acted openly, in front of witnesses, countermanding her direct standing order, lighting a fire she had forbidden, summoning a physician she had not chosen, moving a child against the arrangement of the house. I had at last given her exactly the plain, chargeable disobedience she had been hunting for since the parlor. She had me. And she knew it, and I knew it, and she let herself for one moment smile. "Sergeant Rhee," she said, very quietly, into the warm, crowded room where Alara knelt weeping by her feverish son, and old Dr. Vane bent over him with his ear to the boy's chest. "You have overstepped. You have countermanded the standing orders of this house. You have laid hands on a royal person without leave and moved him against the arrangements I have set. You have summoned a physician not of the house's appointing. There are witnesses to all of it. You will surrender your post and your commission, and you will present yourself to the chamberlain to answer for the gravest breach of discipline I have seen in this house in 20 years. She drew a breath, savoring it. You have made yourself into precisely the thing you pretended not to be, Sergeant. A guard who decides for himself which orders to obey. I imagine you thought yourself very righteous, carrying blankets and running to old women with tales. And now you will hang for it, and there will be no one left inside these walls to trouble me at all." She was right about the facts, every fact. I had disobeyed plainly and provably, and by the letter of discipline she could indeed strip me and turn me out, and I had known that when I picked the boy up, and I had done it anyway, and I would do it again. I opened my mouth to say so, to say only that I had done what the moment required and would answer for it, when a voice spoke from the doorway behind her. "Before the sergeant surrenders anything," said the Crown Prince, "I should like to hear the physician's report on my nephew. Do go on, Dr. Vane." The room went very still. Morwenna turned. I saw her turn, saw the fury flicker and then bank itself down behind the pleasant mask she pulled back on for her stepson. And there in the doorway stood Rowan, in a plain dark coat, not raising his voice, not making any show at all, simply standing where the king should have stood and no longer could. Dr. Vane, an old man with no interest in the politics of the house and every interest in the boy under his hands, gave his report in the flat, careful way of physicians. The child had a settled inflammation of the chest, he said. A serious one, not yet grave, but on the road to grave, and the road was cold and neglect. Had the boy been kept warm and abed at the first sign of the cough, it would have been a trifle. Kept as he had been kept, sent daily to an unheated room, ill, given no proper physicking, it had become a thing that could, in a small body, turn dangerous within days. "Another week of the room he was in," said old Vane, closing his bag, "and I would not have liked to promise your highness anything at all." He did not say who had ordered the room cold. He did not have to. Everyone in that warm, crowded chamber knew whose standing order kept the East Gallery unheated, whose physician had let a child's cough go untended, whose arrangement of the house had put a sick boy at his lessons in the ice. Rowan let the silence do its work. Then he said, still quietly, still to the room and not to her, "So. My nephew was gravely neglected under this roof, and a sergeant of the watch carried him to warmth and a doctor, against a standing order that the house would apparently rather see a child sicken than have a fire lit, and it is the sergeant who is to be charged. He let that hang. Have I understood the matter, your majesty?" It was masterfully done, and I saw Morwenna feel it land. She could not now strip me without the whole house understanding that she was punishing the man who had saved a royal child from her own neglect. Rowan had, in 3 sentences, turned the ground under her feet. My open disobedience, the plain chargeable breach she had waited all winter for, had become, the instant he named the facts aloud, an act of rescue, and her lawful order had become the thing on trial. "The sergeant," she said, and her voice was smooth as ever, but I heard the effort in it now, exceeded his authority. "Whatever the regrettable state of the child's health, the discipline of the house cannot survive if any guard may decide for himself when to obey. Your highness knows that better than anyone. Today it is a fever and a fire. Tomorrow it is a guard who decides he need not obey an order he dislikes. Where does it end?" "It ends," said Rowan, "with a child alive who might not have been. I find I can bear that ending, madam." He turned to me then, and his hard young face gave nothing away, but his words were a shield laid over me in front of them all. "Sergeant Rhee, you disobeyed a standing order of the house to carry a sick child to warmth and a physician. Is that correct?" "It is, your highness. I did. I knew it was disobedience when I did it, and I will answer for it." "Then answer for it now. Why?" "Because the order was to leave him cold, your highness," I said, "and the child was ill, and no order in this house, no order in any house worth the name, is worth a child's life. I would sooner lose my commission having saved him than keep it having stood at my post and watched him worsen. If that is a breach of discipline, then I am guilty of it gladly, and your highness may do with me as you see fit." Rowan looked at me a long moment. "The watch's discipline," he said, "is not obedience for its own sake. It is service to the crown and the blood of Harrowgate. A guard who obeys an order to let the blood come to harm has broken his oath more gravely than one who disobeys to prevent it. You kept your true oath, sergeant, at the cost of a lesser one. There is no charge to answer." He looked at last directly at his stepmother. "Sergeant Rhee remains on the inner watch, and the standing order concerning the East Gallery fires is revoked, as of this hour, by my authority as heir. The children's rooms will be warm. See to it." He did not accuse her. He did not have to. He had done something far more dangerous to her than an accusation. He had shown the whole household, the footmen, the steward, the physicians, the weeping mother, all of them who would carry it in whispers to every corner of the house by nightfall, that the heir had looked at the Queen Consort's arrangement of the children's lives and found it wanting, and had overruled it, and had commended the man who defied it. From that morning, every servant in that house understood which way the wind had begun at last to turn. But I want you to understand, because I did not yet, and it nearly cost us everything, that a cornered enemy is not a beaten one. Morwenna left that room with her pleasant mask fixed on and her back straight, and she said, at the door, in a voice pitched for all of us, "Of course the children's comfort is my only wish. If I have been too austere with them, it was from a want of coddling, not of care. Your Highness is quite right, they shall be warm." And she went. And I, fool that I was, let myself believe for a night or two that we had won, that the fires would be lit and the tables filled and the campaign was over, checked at last by the heir's plain word. I had beaten her in the open, and I thought open defeat would be the end of her. I had it exactly backwards. Open defeat only taught her to stop fighting in the open. She had lost the war of the house's small cruelties, the cold rooms, the thin trays, the dismissed servants, because I and Rowan between us had learned to answer each of them with the house's own machinery. So she abandoned that whole front. And she began, quietly in the deep of that winter, to plan something the machinery of the house could not touch. Not a slight, not a deprivation, not a cruelty I could log and carry up the chain, but a stroke that would remove Ilara's children from the succession, and from the house, and from their mother, entirely and lawfully, all at once. She stopped trying to make their lives cold. She began trying to make them disappear. I learned of it by degrees, the way one learns of a thing that is being built in the dark. The first sign was the lawyers. Morwenna's man of law, a soft-spoken advocate named Trell, who came and went from her rooms at odd hours, began to be a fixture of the house that winter, and the papers he carried were not household papers. I could not read them, that was far beyond my office, but I could see who came and went, and I could see the maps. That was the thing that turned my blood cold, the maps. One evening, standing my post outside the Queen Consort's receiving room, the door opened for a footman bearing wine, and in the gap I saw, spread across her great table, a map of the realm, and marked on it, circled in her own hand, a place I knew. The cloister of St. Bede, far in the cold north, a grim and pious old establishment at the very edge of the kingdom where, in the hard custom of an older age, royal children who were inconvenient to the succession had sometimes been sent to be raised in devotion, which is a soft phrase for shut away, forgotten, removed from the line of inheritance by distance and by cloistered vow, never to marry, never to inherit, never to trouble anyone's ambition again. It had not been done in 3 generations. It was still technically lawful, and she had a map of the road to it circled in her own hand. I understood then what she was building. She meant to persuade the king, the failing, grieving, half-present king, who signed what was put before him and believed what his wife told him, that Ilara's 3 children would be better raised in the pious quiet of the north, away from the grief and turmoil of a house still mourning, for their own good, for their souls, for their health. She meant to address the removal of 3 children from their mother as an act of tender care. And once they were behind the walls of St. Bede, hundreds of cold miles away, taken by lawful order under the king's own signature, no chamberlain's log and no heir's overruling, and no sergeant's small refusal would ever reach them. She would have won, cleanly, lawfully, forever, and the last of Isolde's blood would be shut away in the dark where it could never again remind the house whose children they truly were. And the terrible part, the part that kept me awake in the guardroom through the long night watches, was that I could see how nearly it would work. The king trusted her. Ilara had no standing to refuse the king's own order for her children's care. Adela's guardianship reached to their property, not to a sovereign's decree about their upbringing. Even Rowan, heir though he was, could not simply set aside a signed order of the reigning king without a rupture in the house that might do more harm than the order itself. She had found the one stroke that all our careful machinery could not stop. A decree from the very top, from the one man above the machinery, obtained by working on a grieving old man in the privacy of his own rooms where no guard stood and no log was kept. I could not fight it with procedure. Procedure served the king's signed will, and the king's signed will was exactly what she meant to obtain. I could not fight it with Adela, whose office did not reach it. I could not fight it with Rowan alone, who dared not split the house by openly defying his father. There was only one place in all the world that stroke could be stopped, and it was the same place it was to be made. In the king's own rooms, in the king's own failing mind, in the space between the grieving man and the wife who was lying to him about his grandchildren's good. To reach that space, I would have to do the one thing a sergeant of the watch must never do. I would have to speak to the king. A guard does not speak to the king. I cannot make plain to you how deep that rule runs, how much of the whole edifice of our discipline rests on it. We are furniture to the sovereign, dignified furniture, loyal furniture, but silent. We do not address him. We do not volunteer. We stand at his door and his gate and his side, and we are seen and never heard, and a guard who forgets that has forgotten the first thing about what he is. In 19 years, I had never spoken a word to King Alaric that was not a required answer to a direct question, and I had been asked perhaps 4 questions in all that time. And I was going to break that too, but I was not going to break it foolishly. Because here is what I had learned that whole hard winter, and what Morwenna never learned at all. The small lawful refusals are not weakness. They are the patient assembling of the one moment that matters. Every stone I had taken out of her wall, the blanket, the book, the brooch, the fever, the fire, had done 2 things. It had protected a child in the moment, and it had built quietly a record of a pattern witnessed, remembered, that could be laid before a grieving king all at once, in a single hour, so undeniable that even a mind bent by grief could not look away from it. I had not been merely defending the children all winter. I had been, without fully knowing it, gathering the case that would save them. I went first to Rowan. I had never sought him out. Now I did formally, through the chamberlain, asking leave to speak with the heir on a matter touching the safety of the king's grandchildren. He received me at once. And in his cold study, standing at attention, I laid it all before him, not the small grievances which he knew, but the great one. The lawyer Trell, the papers, the circled map, the cloister of St. Bede, the shape of the thing she was building. I told him I believed the Queen Consort meant to obtain the king's signed decree to send the children north, lawfully, beyond all reach, and that once it was signed nothing in the house could undo it. Rowan heard me out without moving. When I finished he was silent a long while, and then he said something I have never forgotten. "Sergeant, why did you not come to me the first day? The blanket, the cold room. Why carry it all yourself, all winter, one small refusal at a time, when a word to me might have ended it sooner?" "Because a word from you, your highness, ends one cruelty and warns her of the next," I said. "If I had run to you the first day, she would have learned at once that the heir was watching, and she would have hidden everything and moved slower and deeper, and I would have lost the sight of it. By staying small, by fighting each thing myself lawfully, so that it looked like nothing more than one careful sergeant doing his duty, I kept her thinking the only obstacle in the house was a tiresome guard she could not quite catch out. And so she went on building in the open, where I could see the shape of it. My silence was not for want of a word to you, your highness. It was so that when the word came, it would be the whole truth at once, and not a warning shot she could dodge." He looked at me then in a way he never had before. "You have been fighting a war," he said slowly, "that I did not know was a war until the middle of it, and you fought it so that I might win it." He rose. "The king will not hear you, Sergeant. He will not hear me on this. She has his ear, and I am his son, and a son who accuses his father's wife of plotting against his grandchildren will look to a grieving old man like a son grasping too early at the reins. But there is a way this can be laid before him that he cannot wave aside, and it does not run through you or through me. It runs through the children themselves. and through the one witness in this house, whose word even the king cannot dismiss. He meant Adela, and he meant Isolde's book. Here I must slow and tell you carefully, because it is the hinge of everything, and because it is the one part I would not want you to misremember. The plan Rowan and I built over the next 3 days was not a plot of force. We laid no hands on the Queen Consort, drew no weapon, seized no one. That was never the way, and it would never have held. A queen deposed by force is a martyr, and the house would have broken over it. What we built instead was a plan of truth, delivered in the one room and the one moment where the king's own eyes and his own heart could not be managed by his wife. At the family dinner, the twice-weekly gathering where the king sat at the head of his table with all his blood around him, the one place Morwenna's whole campaign depended on keeping bright and false, because it was the only place the king ever saw the children at all. Every one of those dinners all winter had been a performance staged for the king's benefit, the warm hand on Bram's hair, the bright questions, the pretty picture of a loving step-grandmother, so that the sovereign, seeing it, would believe the schoolroom whispers about cold and hunger and dismissed servants were nothing but a grieving daughter's fancies and a meddling guard's tales. The dinner was Morwenna's masterpiece and her shield, and so the dinner was exactly where we would take her. I want to be plain about my own part, because it was small, and it should have been small. I did not stand up at the king's table and denounce the Queen Consort. A sergeant of the watch does not, and if I had, it would have proven her every claim that I was an overreaching servant grasping above my station. My part was to make certain of 2 things only: that the truth would be in the room, and that no one could remove it before the king had seen it. The truth in the room was the children, and it was Adela, who by ancient right could speak at the king's table as senior blood of the house, and whom even Morwenna could not silence. And it was old Dr. Vane's written report on Bram's illness, the plain physician's account of a child made gravely ill by cold and neglect, which I had preserved, which Farrant's people had tried and failed to have amended, and which named no villain but described, in a doctor's flat and unarguable words, exactly what had been done. That report was the single hardest fact in the whole winter, because it could not be called a fancy or a grudge. It was a physician's finding, and I had kept it safe. My part was to keep it safe 1 night longer, and to see that it reached Adela's hand before the dinner, and that it was not intercepted on the way, because if Morwenna's people learned it existed and where it was, it would vanish, as the roster clerk had vanished, as the brooch had reappeared, as every inconvenient thing in that house vanished when she willed it. So for 3 days I carried that folded report inside my own tunic, against my chest, and I did not set it down, and I did not speak of it, and I stood my post, and I waited for the night of the dinner. And it was in those 3 days that she made her last move against me, and nearly won after all. She could not catch me overstepping. Rowan's word had put me beyond her reach for the fever, and I had gone back to giving her nothing chargeable. So she did the thing a clever, cornered enemy does. She stopped trying to remove the guard. She tried to remove the guard's honor, to make me, before the whole house, into exactly the overreaching, insubordinate, untrustworthy servant she had always claimed I was, so that when the truth came out at the dinner, it would come from a discredited mouth and could be waved away as the malice of a guard with a grievance. The trap was the brooch's brother. A thing went missing again, this time from the king's own study. A small seal, an old signet of no great value but great symbolic weight, the sort of object whose loss makes a great noise. And the whisper was arranged, swift and expert, that Sergeant Rhee, who had lately been so very much about the family rooms, so very forward in his duties, so very quick to lay hands where he ought not, had been seen near the study, and had grown strange and secretive of late, forever carrying something inside his tunic that he would let no one see. Which was true. I was carrying something inside my tunic that I would let no one see. It was the physician's report. But it looked exactly as she meant it to look, like a guilty man hiding stolen goods against his chest. They came for me the morning before the dinner. the steward, 2 of Morwenna's household men, and a demand that Sergeant Rhee submit to search, here and now, in the guardroom, for the king's missing seal, and turn out, in particular, whatever it was he had been seen concealing inside his tunic these 3 days past. And there it was. The whole winter, the whole patient war, come down to a folded paper against my chest, and a search I could not refuse without confessing I had something to hide, and could not permit without handing the one hard proof of her cruelty straight into the hands of the people who would make it disappear before the king ever saw it. If I let them search me, the report was gone, and with it the children's last shield. If I refused the search, I was a guard defying a lawful order to clear himself of theft, the plain insubordination she had hunted all winter, handed to her at last, on the very morning she needed it. Either way she won. Either way the dinner that night would come, and there would be either no proof to lay before the king, or no honest man left to lay it. I stood in the guardroom with the steward's hand out for what was inside my tunic, and I understood that every small, careful refusal of the whole long winter had led to this one, where there was no small, careful refusal left to make. There was only the truth, and the wall she had built around it, and one narrow gap I had not yet thought to use. So I used it. I will submit to search gladly, I said, and empty every pocket I have before witnesses, but not before you. A charge against a sergeant of the watch for the theft of the king's own seal is not a household matter for a steward to settle in a guardroom. It is a matter for the watch's own captain, and above him the chamberlain, and above him the heir, and by the standing order of the house, which I know her majesty has lately been at pains to keep, a servant accused of theft against the sovereign's person is to be searched only in the presence of the chamberlain, that the finding be beyond dispute. I will not have it whispered ever after that a thing was slipped into my pocket in a guardroom by the Queen Consort's men. Send for the chamberlain. I will stand here at attention and touch nothing until he comes. And when he comes, I will turn out everything I carry before him, and before the heir if the heir wishes it, and we shall all see together exactly what the sergeant has been hiding against his chest. It was the seam again. The machinery, the procedure, turned one last time. She had kept the order requiring a chamberlain's presence for a theft against the king precisely, because it made her dismissals harder to overturn. She had never dreamed it would one day protect the man she meant to frame. The steward could not search me without the chamberlain, not for the king's own seal, not without making the finding worthless. And to send for the chamberlain was to send for a man who answered to Rowan, and to guarantee that, when I turned out my tunic, it would be before exactly the eyes Morwenna least wanted on it. They sent for the chamberlain because they had no lawful way not to, and by the time he came, unhurried and grave, the report was no longer against my chest, because in the quarter hour of waiting, standing at attention, touching nothing, I had asked the chamberlain's own runner, sent ahead, to carry a folded paper directly to Princess Adela with my compliments, a paper the sergeant wished Her Highness to have before dinner. It went out of the guardroom in the open, by the house's own messenger, witnessed, untouchable, and when at last I turned out my tunic before the chamberlain and the 2 household men, there was nothing in it but a guardsman's oddments and no seal at all, and the whole accusation collapsed into the empty air where the proof had been meant to be. The king's seal, of course, was found that afternoon. It had never left the study. It had been the brooch's trick over again, and no apology was offered and none expected. But the trap had failed. The report was in Adela's hands, and the dinner was that night. I stood my post at the door of the great dining hall that evening, as I had 100 nights, and I have never in 19 years stood a watch that cost me what that one did, because I could do nothing now but stand, and let the truth I had guarded all winter do its own work, in a room I was not permitted to enter. At a table, I could only watch across. They gathered as they always did, the king at the head, grayer and more shrunken than I had ever seen him, a great chair swallowing a small tired man. Morwenna at his right, radiant, warm, her hand already moving to Bram's hair, for the children were there. All three, scrubbed and quiet and watchful, Torin holding his shoulders square, Malin with her grandmother's gray eyes moving from face to face, Bram pale still from his illness but warm and alive and there. Ilara drawn and careful, Rowan cold and still. And at the king's left hand, in the place of the senior blood of the house, old Princess Adela, with a folded paper resting beside her plate. Morwenna saw the paper. I watched her see it. I watched her not know what it was, and decide it did not matter, and begin the performance. The bright question to Torin, the praise of Malin's needlework, the hand on Bram's hair, the whole warm false picture built for the one pair of eyes at the head of the table that she needed to keep deceived. And Adela let her finish. That was the mercy and the cruelty of it. The old woman let Morwenna build the whole pretty picture, the loving step-grandmother, the happy children, and then, into the small silence after, she said, in that voice like a closing gate, "Brother, before we eat, there is a paper here I am bound by my office to lay before you, and I will not sit at your table under a false picture while I hold it." And she unfolded old Dr. Vane's report, and she read it aloud, the whole of it, the physician's flat, unarguable words. A child of 6 brought to serious illness of the chest by a cold room and untended cough, and a standing order that the fire not be lit. And then she set it down, and she looked at her brother the king, and she said, "This is your grandson, Alaric. This is Isolde's grandson. And this was done to him under your roof, by an order of this house, while you were told at this very table that all was well." The king did not understand at first. I watched him not understand, watched the gray tired face turn from Adela to the paper to the boy, to small pale Bram sitting warm and quiet beside the Queen Consort's hand. "Bram was ill," he said. "No one told me the boy was ill." And there was the whole tragedy of that winter in one old man's bewildered question. That a king could sit at his own table twice a week all winter, and never once be told the truth about his own grandchildren, because the one who sat at his right hand had made certain he never was. And then Malin spoke. She was 9 years old. She had learned that winter, which grown people would help and which would only tell her to be a good girl and make no trouble, and she had learned to be silent, and she had a child's terror of the great cold table and the greater cold woman beside her grandfather. But she stood up, small, straight, gray-eyed, so exactly her grandmother that I saw the king's breath catch to look at her, and she said, in a voice that shook and did not stop, "Grandpapa, it's true. Bram was cold all winter, and so were we, and our fires weren't lit, and our suppers were thin, and Dame Pell was almost sent away for stealing when she never stole anything, and they took grandmother's book and locked it in a cupboard, and the only reason Bram is warm now and got a doctor is Sergeant Rhee carried him, and he wasn't supposed to, and he did it anyway, and he says the oldest order in the house is to keep us from harm, and it's older than anyone who says different. Please, Grandpapa, please don't send us away to the cold place in the north. We heard about it. We're not soft and we don't need less coddling. We just want to stay with Mama and be warm." And then it was very quiet at the king's table. I have gone over that silence 1,000 times in the years since, and I do not think anything Rowan or Adela or I could ever have said would have done what a 9-year-old shaking voice did in it. Because the king looked at that child, at Isolde's gray eyes and a small frightened face, asking him not to send her away to the cold, and something came awake in the grieving old man that had been asleep for 6 winters. He looked at the paper. He looked at his grandson, pale and warm and alive by his wife's hand. He looked slowly, terribly at his wife. "The cold place in the north," he said, "St. Bede." He said it the way a man says a word from a dream he did not know he was having. "Morwenna, there is talk of sending my grandchildren to St. Bede." And I watched the Queen Consort make the one mistake that undid her. She had 100 smooth answers, and if she had reached for the softest of them, grief and care, and only the children's good and the sergeant's tales and a little girl's fancy, She might even then have held her ground, for the king loved her and wanted to believe her. But she had lost too much that winter, been checked too many times by a guard and a boy and an old woman and a paper, and the fury she had banked so long slipped its rein for one fatal instant, and she said, not warmly, not softly, but cold and quick and true, "The children are not of my blood, and they will always stand between this house and its future, and I have done nothing that was not lawful. I have done nothing that was not lawful." It was the truest thing she ever said, and it damned her because it admitted the whole of it in a breath, that there had been a plan, that the children stood in her way, that everything done to them all that cold winter had been done on purpose and defended as legal. And she said it, at last, to the king's own face, in front of his blood and his house. The warm, false picture broke in that instant and could never be built again. King Alaric was old and bent and half lost in grief. But he had been a king for 50 years, and there is a thing that wakes in such a man, even at the very end, when he sees at last that he has been made a fool of about his own family under his own roof. He rose from the great chair slowly, a small, tired man making himself tall, and the whole table rose with him, and he said, in a voice that had not carried like that in years, "Nothing that was not lawful." He let it hang. "You will find, madam, that a king is the law in his own house, and that what a king permits, a king may also revoke. There will be no Saint Bede. There will be no removal of these children from their mother, now or ever, by any hand. And you and I, madam, are going to have a long and honest reckoning tonight about everything that has been done under this roof while I was told all was well." That was the last dinner Morwenna ever presided over at the king's table. I will not pretend there was a great crash, a queen dragged from a hall, a crowd roaring. That is not how such things end in an old house, and it is not how this one ended. It ended as it had been fought, in quiet, but the quiet this time was hours. The reckoning the king spoke of lasted not one night but many weeks, and it was conducted at his order, through the very machinery I had learned to work all winter. The logs, the reports, the standing orders, the chamberlain's careful files. Rowan laid it all before his father, the pattern of the cold rooms and the thin trays, witnessed and recorded, the dismissed tutors, the framing of Dame Pell, the lawyer Trell and the circled map, the physician Farrant's neglect, the 2 thefts that had never happened, the plan for St. Bede, drafted and waiting for a signature that would now never come. None of it was a guard's tale or a grieving daughter's fancy. All of it was on paper, gathered patiently, one small refusal at a time, across a whole cold winter. A case a grieving king could not look away from once his eyes were open, because I had spent the season making certain it would be undeniable when the hour came. Morwenna was not executed, nor imprisoned, nor made a martyr. The king was too wise and too weary for spectacle. She was, instead, quietly stripped of her household, her steward, her lawyers, her control of the schoolroom and the kitchens and the fires, her hand in the running of every room in which a child of Isolde's blood might ever set foot. She kept the empty title and lost every particle of the power she had used it for, which for a woman like Morwenna was a harder sentence than a cell. Her son Cassius and her daughter Verena, who had grown fat on the children's stolen suppers, were sent to the distant estates that had been meant, all along, for other people's children. And in time, for these things move slowly in an old house, she withdrew from the court altogether, to a dower house far from the capital where she could injure no one, and where the fires, I am told, were always exactly as warm as she wished them, and where no one at all came to see her. Dame Pell taught music in that house for the rest of her days, and died in her own warm bed with a pension, which the crown prince himself had signed. Isolde's book of verses was returned to the children's own hands and never locked away again. Malin reads them still, I am told, to her own children now. The long gallery stayed lit, and the gray-eyed woman in the largest portrait went on watching the corridor, and the children went on standing before her and telling each other stories, and no one ever again suggested that it was a treason to remember whose house it truly was. And the fires in the East Gallery were lit every morning of every winter thereafter, by standing order of the king, which was never revoked while I served, and which I like to think has never been revoked since. As for me, the king sent for me, a sergeant of the watch, some weeks after that last dinner, and I stood before him in his own rooms, at attention, certain I was to be either commended or quietly reproved for a winter of a guard forgetting his station. He looked at me a long while with his tired gray eyes, and then he said a thing I have carried with me every day since. "They tell me, Sergeant, that you never once broke an order you could keep, and never once kept one you could not break in honor. That you fought a whole winter's war inside my house with nothing but blankets and questions, and the standing orders of my own chamberlain. That you gathered the truth of it a stone at a time and guarded it against your chest, and never spoke a word above your station until the hour it would save 3 children and not a moment sooner." He shook his head slowly. "I have had generals who understood less of duty than that. What would you have me give you, man? Ask, and it is yours." And I said the only thing I could honestly say. "Your Majesty, I did not do it for a reward, and I would be ashamed to take one for it. I did it because a guard's oldest order is to keep the blood of the house from harm, and I found one winter that I had let myself forget it, and I could not go on standing my post having forgotten it. If your Majesty wishes to give me anything, give me leave to go on standing it. That is the whole of what I want." He gave me that, and one thing more that I had not asked for. He made me captain of the children's own guard, a new post, created that day, a standing watch over Ilara's children that answered to no steward and no consort and no household office, but only to the heir and the blood of Harrogate directly, so that never again could a cold room or a thin tray or a circled map be quietly built around them in the dark. I held that post until my knees gave out, and I trained the man who holds it now, and the first thing I taught him, the first thing, before the drill and the standing orders and the discipline of the still man, was the thing it took me 19 years and one hard winter to learn myself. I told him that the discipline of a guard is not obedience. Obedience is only the shape of it. The heart of it is knowing exactly which oath is the deepest one, and keeping that one whole when all the smaller orders in the world are pulling you to break it, and having the patience, when you cannot strike, to fight the long, quiet war of small lawful refusals, a blanket and a question and an open door at a time, until the hour comes when the truth you have guarded can be laid at last before the man with the power to set it right. They call what I did that winter a rebellion, those few who know the whole of it. Perhaps it was. But if it was the quietest rebellion ever waged in that house. A war fought without a single blow struck or a single order plainly broken until the very end. Won by a still man who simply, finally, refused to keep looking away. It began with a folded blanket and a small cold boy at his letters, and one question I could not answer comfortably. "Are you allowed to do that?" "I am allowed," I told him, "to keep the king's grandchildren from harm. That is the oldest order there is in this house, older than anyone who might tell you different." I believed it when I said it to a shivering child in a cold gallery. I believe it still. And I have never, in all the years since, found any order worth more than that one, nor any winter I am prouder to have spent than the one I gave to keeping it.